The calendar called it Good Friday. Washington had never looked more beautiful to Mary and me. The lilacs bursting on their branches outside the White House. The air fragrant with their blossoms. The promise of a new spring. The first spring for over 4 years without the Civil War. And the calendar called it Good Friday. The battles and the bloodshed of the deadliest, costliest war in civilized humanity up to that time were over. Bull Run, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Atlanta. Names on the land, north and south, long remembered as the fiery scenes of war. The calendar called it Good Friday, and it was a time of renewal, of relaxation. That night I attended a play with Mary and some friends, sitting in the presidential box, Mr. Lincoln's box, they called it. We awaited the next scene. In the shadows behind me, another man waited, his mind a fuse box of hatred primed to explode. In one hand he held a single-shot derringer, in the other a steel dagger. He sighted along the barrel and less than 5 feet from me, pulled the trigger. The .44 caliber lead bullet entered my head, crossed obliquely through my brain, and lodged into my right eye. The assassin cried out, "Sic semper tyrannis! Thus be it ever to tyrants." And the calendar called it Good Friday. And at that blinding moment, I could see myself quite clearly as a young man, penniless and homeless. In those days, I was nothing more than a piece of floating driftwood stranded in the village of New Salem, Illinois. Now, some people have tried to make more of me and of my beginnings, but it's a great piece of folly to try. It can all be condensed into a single sentence, which you'll find in Gray's Elegy, "The Short and Simple Annals of the Poor." About sums it up. From both my parents, I inherited 2 things, an iron constitution and a decent poverty. My people, who were Quakers, came over from England before the Declaration of Independence. It was pioneering country then. Grandfather Abraham was killed by Indians while farming. I never did know too much about who my grandfather was. I was much more concerned about who his grandson may become. In fact, my first, though perhaps not my most inspired pieces of poetry, I wrote in my exercise book at the ripe old age of 8. Abraham Lincoln is my name, and with this pen I wrote the same. I wrote it both in haste and speed, and left it here for fools to read. Abraham Lincoln, his name and pen. He may be great, but God knows when. In those days, I worked as a migrant farm worker, earning a day's pay here and there. I remember a farmer, James Taylor, once asked me if I could kill a hog, so I told him, "Well, sir, if you're willing to risk the hog, I'm willing to risk myself." Earned my first pair of trousers splitting rails. Say, "Mrs. Miller, if I offered to split some rails for you, would you give me some yardage of brown jeans?" "You will? How many for how much?" 400 split rails for 1 yard. "Mrs. Miller, with my appendages, I doubt there are enough rails in the entire state of Illinois to construct my pantaloons." So many people have commented about the length of my legs, I began to wonder, how long should a man's legs be in proportion to the rest of his body? Thinking it over considerably, I delivered myself of a learned opinion that a man's lower limbs, in order to preserve harmony of proportion, should be at least long enough to reach from his body to the ground. When I came of age, I didn't know much. I had a little formal learning in a lab school, education by repetition. I was always interested in grammar and the English language, the only language, unfortunately, that I ever learned. I could read, write, and cipher to the rule of 3, and that was about it. Any additional education I picked up, it was under the pressure of necessity. Back in those days, anyone who gave me a book was my best friend. I was a diligent student of Shakespeare. To know the bard can be a liberal education, and amongst other poets, Robert Burns is my inseparable companion, a people's poet. Give fools their silk and knaves their wine. A man's a man for all that, and all that. Their tinsel show and all that. The honest man, though e'er say poor, is king of men, for all that. I find it very difficult to scratch anything on this brain of mine, but nearly impossible to get it off once it's there. Over the years, I collected a number of anecdotes, or Lincoln stories, as my friends called them. Now, mind you, I didn't make the stories mine simply by telling them. I was only a retail dealer. But I needed them on occasion to save a long-winded argument or to disarm an opponent, and sometimes I needed them to get me out of my occasional bouts of melancholy. Oh yes, I have them too. And I always found a story most effective when I told it against myself. Now that reminds me of a story. I was in Decanter listening to a gentleman banker lecture about the virtues of the banking system. He went on and on, freely dispensing wisdom and advice without charging a penny interest. When he was finished, I heckled him, and he asked me my name. "So you're Abraham Lincoln," he said, and I had to admit that I was. "They tell me, Mr. Lincoln, that you are a self-made man." So I conceded that what there was of me was indeed self-made. "Well, Mr. Lincoln, in that case, from what I can see, it was a damn bad job." He wasn't the first, and by no means the last, to critique me and my appearance. In fact, I can remember many years later when I was in the White House, Edward Dicey, a journalist from England, wrote about me in the London Spectator, and he said, "Mr. Lincoln wore an ill-fitting suit of black, creased and puckered up and soiled at every salient point in the figure." Would you agree with Mr. Dicey? Well, here, let me recite this one for you. It's one of my favorite pieces of poetry, written by a Southern minister, Abraham Lincoln. "His cheekbones were high, and his visage was rough, like a middling of bacon, all wrinkled and tough. His nose was as large and as ugly and big as the snout of a half-starved Illinois pig." Well, you can just tell that was from a minister. That reeks of the Lord's charity. If you want my word on it, by the time he's 40, every man is wearing the face he deserves. You know, all men and women have certain turning points in their lives, flashes of wisdom burned deep in their memories. I've often wondered what it was that turned Abraham Lincoln against slavery in his youth. Thinking back on it, I believe it was the slave auctions I witnessed with my own eyes when I was working as a floatsman, pulling a raft of goods down the Mississippi River. Along the riverbank in New Orleans, I saw dealers in human degradation, selling men and women like so many hogs. On the auction block was a beautiful girl named Eliza. A Frenchman from New Orleans bid $1,040 for her, but he was outbid by a young Methodist minister. The auctioneer pulled the dress from Eliza's shoulders, exposing her breasts, and said, "Who's going to lose a chance like this?" The sweating Frenchman bid again, but once again he was outbid by the young minister. The auctioneer lifted Eliza's dress, exposing her from her toes to her waist, slapped her on the thigh, and said, "Who's going to win this prize?" The Frenchman bid again. The auctioneer raised his gavel. Eliza looked at the minister in terror and pleading. And once again, the minister outbid the Frenchman. The gavel came down, and Eliza fell in a faint. The auctioneer said, "Well, sir, you got her damn cheap. What are you going to do with her?" And the minister, whose name was Fairbanks, and was one of the leaders of the anti-slavery movement in Ohio, said, "Free her." I have since learned that Fairbanks has spent 17 years in a southern penitentiary for his anti-slavery activities. Mind you, he was one of the lucky ones. In the southern states, leaders of slave revolts can and had been hanged. I once saw a gentleman who had bought 12 Negroes all over Kentucky, taking them to his farm in the south. Each Negro had an iron clevis around his left wrist, which was fastened by means of a short chain to the main chain, so that each slave was strung up. There they were, like so many fish on a line. And in that condition, they were being separated forever from their parents, from their wives, from their children, going into perpetual slavery, where the lash is ruthless and unrelenting. I learned another lesson during my youth in New Salem, that Abraham Lincoln was not cut out to be a professional soldier. Would you believe that I was a military man once? Oh yes. I fought, bled, and came away unscathed. I didn't break my sword because I had none to break, but I bent my musket pretty badly. I became a military man for the same reason it has inspired many an enlistment in the name of patriotism. I had nothing better to do. See, there was some trouble in northern Illinois between the Indians and white settlers. I volunteered for 30 days. The Clary Grove boys, all from the village of New Salem, elected me captain, an honor that gave me more satisfaction than any subsequent success in my life. They were no easy bunch of boys to drill into obeying orders, and I was an amateur myself. I remember one time, I just couldn't remember the order to get a platoon to pass edgewise 2 by 2 through a gate. So I yelled out, "This company is dismissed for 2 minutes, and it will fall in again on the other side of the gate." I willingly gave up the life of a soldier to return to New Salem, serving as postmaster. Now, what I liked best about that job is that I got a chance to read the newspapers before I distributed them. One day as postmaster, I received a letter asking about the financial rating of one of my neighbors from a big bank in New York City. So, as postmaster, I responded, "Sirs, I am well acquainted with him and know his circumstances. Now, first of all, he has a wife and a baby. Together they should be worth $50,000 to any man. Secondly, he has an office in which there is a table worth $1.50 and 3 chairs worth, say, $1. Finally, there is in the corner a large rat hole, which will bear looking into. Yours respectfully, A. Lincoln, Postmaster." One day at an auction in Springfield, I obtained a copy of Blackstone's commentaries, and day after day, month after month, I read and reread the principles of English common law. At first, I practiced on my friends and neighbors. We both took our chances. But most of my knowledge of the law I gained riding the judicial circuit, courthouse to courthouse, throughout the state of Illinois. And then I partnered with my young friend, William Herndon, and we formed the legal firm of Lincoln and Herndon. Took every case that came our way, no matter how small. Say, Billy, this filing system could do with a little improvement. Now, I've created a new file for you which reads, if nowhere else, look for it here. So many people have speculated on how Abraham Lincoln ever got into politics. Well, I started at the same time I practiced law, and I'll tell you this. You don't wait to be pushed forward by older men. All that's necessary to run for office in this country is to declare yourself. And lung power counts more than a campaign purse. Fellow citizens, I presume you all know who I am. I've been solicited by my friends and neighbors to stand for office in the Illinois legislature. Now, my opponent has alluded to the fact that I am a young man. Well, I am younger in years than I am in the tricks of politicians, but I would rather die now than, like the gentleman, live to see the day when I must erect a lightning rod on the top of my house, as he has done in Springfield, to protect a guilty conscience from an offended God. What's that, sir? No, I don't mind heckling as long as there's a question at the end of it. And in your case, sir, it doesn't even have to be an intelligent question. My politics, short and sweet, like the old woman's dance. Now, if elected, I promise I will bring to work a sincere heart. Whether I bring a head equal to that heart will be for future times to determine. Well, I lost, coming 8th in a crowd of 13, but at least in my own village of New Salem, I received 277 out of 300 votes, and that encouraged me. And I didn't let one early defeat turn me away from playing politics, my lifetime profession, so I subsequently stood for office, got elected, and served a total of 4 terms in the legislature. To Springfield at different times came 2 Marys, both from Kentucky. Miss Mary Owens, the daughter of a well-fixed farmer, about my size and weight. No, I lie. She was a little heavier. And Mary Todd of the Kentucky Todds. That's Todd, by the way, with 2 D's. With God, 1 D is enough, but the Todds needed 2. I courted the first one sporadically and married the second one eventually. I made a few tentative professions of affection to Miss Mary Owens, who was a pleasantly plump young lady, but unfortunately she left Springfield to return to her home in Kentucky. And during those long evenings in the legislature, I found myself thinking about her and wanting to see her again. And then 3 years later, she returned to Springfield. I must say I was stomached a little, seeing her in the flesh rather than my imagination. I knew she was oversized, but now she presented a fair match for Falstaff. I knew they called her an old maid, and I never doubted the first part of that description. But you see, her age was difficult to determine, you see. Her skin was too full of fat to permit it contracting into wrinkles. And her want of teeth and weather-beaten look gave me the opinion that nothing could have commenced from the size of infancy and reached its present bulk in less than 40 years. In short, I was not at all pleased with her. But between building my legal career and my time in the legislature, I had little time for the fairer sex, so it wasn't until the winter of 1840 that I began to pay particular court to Molly, Mary Todd. She was stylish, and I was, well, what you see. She came from a distinguished Kentucky family, and so did I. Mine was distinguished by its poverty. She had charm and personality and a long line of suitors. I remember once I went up to her to dance and I said, "Miss Todd, I want to waltz with you in the worst way." And I'm afraid I did. Well, eventually we became engaged. I wanted to impress her and her distinguished family. In fact, I even dueled for the lady. Or rather, I accepted a challenge to risk my neck gallantly on her behalf. See, Mary and one of her friends, Julia Jane, had written a series of anonymous letters to the editor of the Squanguomo Journal. Now, the letters were nothing more than political horseplay, but they insulted James Shields, the Illinois state auditor, accusing him of dishonesty and strutting himself in Springfield society. Now, Shields was a County Tyrone boy with an Irishman's short fuse. And what's worse, he was a Democrat. Irishman and Democrat, that is an explosive combination. So I thought to cover for the ladies by claiming the letters as my own, and I suppose to make matters a little worse, I offered to fight Shields with potatoes, shillelaghs, or cow dung at 5 paces. That only served to infuriate him. Before I knew it, we were both on a horse ferry with our seconds behind, heading to an island over the river. We glared and glowered at each other across a 10-foot plank, while our seconds tried to get us to call the whole thing off. "Do you know," they said, "that dueling is illegal? The winner could be jailed. It's not going to do the loser much good either." But Shields said, "I know, but my honor must be satisfied." And we know what I said. "That reminds me of a story about the young Kentucky man who enlisted in the War of 1812. He was saying goodbye to his sweetheart when she told him that she had embroidered a bullet pouch on which she had stitched the words, 'Victory or Death.' And the young soldier thought that over for a while, and he said, 'Ain't that a little strong? Why can't it be victory or be crippled?' See, Shields didn't laugh. So I said, 'Now look here, Shields, you know that I had no intention of damaging your reputation or your standing as a gentleman. And are you prepared to publish a statement to that effect?' 'Yes.' So he stuck out his hand, we shook, and returned arm in arm to Springfield. Now, please don't circulate that story. It's not the type that you want to see in the biography of a political candidate, and you won't find it in mine, I promise you. When news of our dueling fiasco got back to Springfield, Mary was impressed, but I was distraught. I became burdened by doubts about my abilities as a lawyer, a legislator, and a married man, all at once. And so, on New Year's Day, 1841, my fatal first, we broke off our engagement. Mary, it's no use trying to determine whose fault it is, yours or mine. Love isn't a court case to be won or lost. Marriage isn't a contract. It's a conditional emotion, mutually felt. That's what I said, but I was desperate. Losing her was like losing a part of myself. I was melancholic and sick in mind and body. I needed help and advice. Doc, are you in? It's me, Lincoln. Oh, Oh, you thought I'd be back. Thank goodness for that. Oh, Doc, I have been making a most wretched exhibition of myself. I've had 2 cat fits and a duck fit. Sometimes I fear I'm as crazy as a loon. There is a wide streak of melancholy on my soul, Doc. And now even dreams disturb my sleep. Bad dreams. Even when I turn to Shakespeare to take my mind off my melancholy, every passage seems to scream out about my condition. The heartaches and 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to, the pangs of despised love. Oh, I could be contained in a nutshell and become a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams. Now I fear I'm becoming a burden for Hamlet. I have a little passage I cut out and carry with me. May I read it to you? Oh, why should the spirit of mortals be proud? Like a swift fleeing meteor, a fast flying cloud, a flash of the lightning, a break in the wave, he passes from life to his end in the grave. That depresses you too, Doc. I must be the most miserable man alive. If what I'm feeling were evenly distributed amongst the entire human race, there wouldn't be a single cheerful face. Well, what's your diagnosis, Doc? Hypochondriasis? What's that in plain language? Hellish gloom. Well, thanks for that, Doc. What's that you've written here? Words of comfort? Melancholy is a misfortune, not a personal fault. You put that nicely for a friend and physician. Well, thank you, Doc. I'll remember that in the middle of the night. And a year later, and many a nightly visit to Doc Henry, Simeon Francis, the editor of the Squanguomo Journal, arranged for Mary and me to meet again. Simeon and I had always been close, but never more so than when he offered his home for Mary and mine's reunion. Be friends again, he said. And when I saw Mary again, I realized why I had been so miserable without her. Mary Todd, I said, you look wonderful. And she returned the favor. Abraham Lincoln, she said, you look terrible. We learned there was still laughter in our hearts. We were a little older then, a little wiser, and a little more tolerant of our mutual peculiarities. The suns of summer shone brightly, and then in the autumn of 1842, Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd pledged their love to each other forever. It was a source of profound wonder for me then, and it still is. Mary and I had 4 sons, all born in Springfield. Each son was different, each beloved by both of us, and each indulged by their father. Spoiled, Mary would say. She was the disciplinarian in our household, and I have to admit that her authority even extended over the 5th boy in the Lincoln home. With Mary's blessing, I decided that certain challenges extended beyond Springfield and the Illinois state legislature. I started telling my political friends, if you should hear that Abraham Lincoln does not want to go to Congress, I wish you would tell him that you have reason to believe he is mistaken. The truth is, I very much want to go. And don't keep this too confidential. Fellow citizens and neighbors in the 7th Congressional District, I am honored to run as your candidate and friend. My distinguished opponent, Preacher Peter Cartwright, is seizing on false issues. Now, he says I openly scoff at Christianity. Now, it is true that I do not belong to any congregation, but I have never denied the truth of the Scriptures. You know, Preacher Peter Cartwright reminds me of another preacher in southern Illinois who got in the pulpit one day and said, "Our Savior was the only perfect man to ever appear on this earth, and there is no mention in the Bible of a perfect woman." Then a woman in the audience interrupted him. "I know of a perfect woman, and I have heard about her every day for the last 20 years. So the preacher asked, "Who is she?" "My husband's first wife." I went to hear Preacher Peter Cartwright campaign at one of his prayer meetings. He got in front of the crowd and said, "All those who would give their hearts to God and would go to heaven will rise." Men, women, and children got to their feet. He saw me still sitting there. Then he said, "All those who do not want to go to hell will rise." And then he said, "I see you all want to give your hearts to God and do not want to go to hell. The sole exception is Mr. Lincoln. So I ask you, Mr. Lincoln, where do you want to go?" Preacher Peter Cartwright asked me directly where I'm going, heaven or hell. So I will give him an answer with equal directness. I would prefer not to go to either. Yet, I am going to Congress. Well, let's see what the final vote count was in the Squanguomo Journal. Abraham Lincoln, 6,370 votes. Preacher Peter Cartwright, 4,829 votes. Well, perhaps Preacher Cartwright has learned there was a little truth to what I said in Clinton. You can fool some of the people all of the time, and you can fool all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. I hope the Squanguomo Journal and the other newspapers will just continue to call me Mr. Lincoln without the honorable in front of it. Honorable in front of your name means there can't be honest or even honorable discussion amongst friends. So I prepared to take up my duties as a congressman, and I wanted to go to Washington. The United States Supreme Court had decided, wrongly, that the Negro was a chattel, not a human being, and thus could not sue for his freedom. And that the southern states, the slave states, could not be deprived of their human property rights. Property rights in human beings. The progress of degradation in this country is rapid. We began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now read it that all men are created equal except Negroes. When these know-nothings come to power, it will read, all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When this day comes, I believe I should prefer to emigrate to some other country that makes no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. On this point, hold firm as with a chain of steel. Those who would deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it. Oh yes, I wanted to go to Washington. Washington, April 16th, 1848, dear Mary. In this troublesome world, we are never quite satisfied. When you were here, I thought you hindered me some in attending to business. But now, having nothing but business, no variety, it has grown exceedingly tasteless to me. I hate to sit down and direct documents, and I hate to stay in this old room by myself. What did Eddie and Bobby think of the little letters Father sent them? Don't let the blessed fellows forget their father. Most affectionately, A. Lincoln. I should be exhilarated, but dark clouds of depression cloud my mind. Lexington, April 1848, my dear husband. How much I wish instead of writing we were together this evening. I feel very sad away from you. I feel weary and tired enough to know that this is Saturday night and our babies are upstairs asleep. Do not fear the children have forgotten you. I was only jesting. Even Ed's eyes brighten at the mention of your name. Truly yours, M.L. In the large house where I lived with some of my fellow congressmen, we would sit around the fire after dinner discussing slavery. They asked me what I felt in my heart. I told them, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. That is my idea of democracy, and anything that differs from that is not democracy. But as a freshman congressman in the party out of power, there was little I could do to abolish slavery in my one term of office, and that term came to a sudden end when I challenged the president. See, President Polk's Democrats were trying to get us to justify an unjust war with Mexico. Even though I knew that it would upset my constituents back in Springfield, I felt I had to speak up. In his war message, the president declares that the soil was ours where hostilities commenced with Mexico. But the president's evidence fails him. It is a singular fact that the president ordered the army into the midst of a settlement of Mexican people. There and thereby the first blood of this war was shed. On that very spot, the war with Mexico was unnecessarily and unconstitutionally commenced. Now, sir, let the president answer plainly and without evasion. If he can show that the soil was ours where the first blood was shed, then I will be most happy to reverse my vote. But if he will not do this, then he is deeply conscious of being in the wrong, and he must feel that the blood of this war, like the blood of Abel, is crying out to heaven against him. Well, I see that my time is up. I will gladly yield my last minute to the glorifiers of war. They will need it more than I. Mary, I'd like to read these papers first. I'll join you and the boys in the kitchen in a moment. Did you read the Illinois State Register? I expected criticism, Mary, but this is excessive. Many men in this district have gone off to war. What will those gallant men say when they learn that their representative called the fight in which they struggle unnecessary and unconstitutional? Some of them won't say anything, Mary. They'll be the silent casualties. Henceforth, Lincoln will be known as the Benedict Arnold of Illinois, branded as a traitor. Well, Mary, you're no longer married to a United States congressman. I can always turn to Shakespeare for solace. As the Duke of Venice said to Othello, to mourn a mischief that is past and gone is the next way to draw new mischief on. What cannot be preserved when fortune takes, patience, her injury, a mockery makes. I can practice patience too, Mary, if needed, and if not, I can always practice law. So it was time to hitch up and ride the legal circuit once again and await new opportunities. They came sooner than I expected, with the proposition to expand slavery into the new territories. That burning issue aroused me to run for a spot in the U.S. Senate against Judge Stephen A. Douglas. Fellow citizens, as the campaign concludes, Judge Douglas gets more and more desperate. He is now trying to make capital out of the fact that in my youth, I worked at a grocery store that served whiskey. Now, it is true. What the judge says is true. What he didn't say was that he was my best customer. Now, I've only got one small point to add. I have since left my side of the bar, while Judge Douglas continues to sit at his. Judge Douglas says that he is opposed to Negro citizenship. He claims that this government was created by white men, for white men, and their posterity forever. But I say there is no reason why the Negro is not entitled to every right enumerated in the Declaration of Independence: the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Judge Douglas says that the Negro is not my equal. But I say that in the right to eat the bread without leave of anyone else, which his own hand earns, he is my equal, and the equal of every living man. What's that, sir? If I love Negroes so much, why don't I marry one? I protest that counterfeit logic that assumes just because I should not want a black woman for a slave, I must necessarily want her for a wife. I need not have her for either. I can let her alone. That is all I ask. If you do not like him, leave him alone. If God gave him but little, that little, let him enjoy. Friends, today concludes this campaign. The planting and the culture are over, and there remains but the harvest. If there is one single man among us who does not believe that the institution of slavery is wrong, then he ought not be among us. Slavery is a violation of the eternal right and the greatest threat to the Union. Oh yes, we have tempered with it for over 100 years because of the necessity of our condition. But as sure as God reigns and school children read, that foul black lie can never be consecrated into God's hallowed truth. Well, I lost. But from that defeat, there sprung a new hope in me, a new dream. Perhaps it all started with a letter that appeared in the Chicago Times, which read, "Although beaten, Abraham Lincoln is now a national man and the Republican Party's future spokesman. That vision seemed to be shared by the Republican National Committee, who came to visit me in my home in Springfield, led by their chairman, Jess Fell. Sit down, Jess, sit down. Are you serious? You really think I could be a formidable candidate for the presidency? Well, I don't know what to say. And that, for me, is unusual. Would you like something to drink, Jess? You would? Mary, get a pitcher of iced water for Jess. I must admit that the taste is in my mouth a little to be president, but there are other men more electable than I. Men with radical ideas and outspoken opinions. My qualities are viewed by most to be negative. They have long records. I have none. I was born and have ever remained in the most humble walks of life. I have no wealthy relatives to recommend me. You mean that? That's just the kind of candidate you're looking for? Mary, you didn't put anything in that ice water, did you? Well, Jess, if you are serious, I would be honored to accept the nomination. But I must warn you that your optimism far exceeds mine. And I certainly don't feel enough of a candidate to attend the convention. Well, Godspeed, Jess, and thank you for your confidence, however misplaced. I did not go to the convention in Chicago. Instead, I campaigned on behalf of the Republican cause, traveled over 4,000 miles, made 23 speeches, never once expressing in public my desire to be the presidential nominee. When a not very great man is mentioned for a great position, it's apt to turn his head a little. The convention in Chicago lasted 3 days. At the end of the first day, my supporters telegraphed me, "Very quiet, but we are moving heaven and earth." At the end of the second day, "Keep cool, things are working." At the beginning of the third day, "Very promising, don't get excited." And at the end of the third day, we did it. Glory to God. From my inmost heart, I congratulate you. Just fell. In the national election, the voters were pretty badly split, reflecting all the divisions in the North and in the South and in the minds of the American people. 2 women who were Quakers were overheard conversing in a railroad carriage. "I believe Judge Douglas will be president." "Why dost thou think so?" "Because Judge Douglas is a praying man." "So is Abraham Lincoln a praying man." "Yes, but the Lord will think that Mr. Lincoln is joking." Well, thankfully, the Lord didn't think that Abraham Lincoln was joking, and neither did the voters. And so, I prepared to return to Washington, no longer as a one-term congressman, but as President of the United States, united, but divided. Say, Billy, don't forget our new file. If nowhere else, look for it here. Billy, you and I have been partners for going on 16 years now. We've never had a cross word in all that time. Now, I'd like that sign of Lincoln and Herndon to remain hanging there undisturbed. Give our clients to understand that the election of a president doesn't mean anything changes for the firm of Lincoln and Herndon. If I live, I'll come back to Springfield one day, and you and I, Billy, we'll go back to practicing law as if nothing ever happened. My friends, no one, not in my position, can appreciate my feelings of sorrow at this parting. To this place and to the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived for a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one is buried. I leave you now, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of that divine being, whoever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. To his care commending you, as I hope with your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell. From whence shall we expect the approach of danger? Shall some transatlantic military giant step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe and Asia could not by force take a drink from the Ohio River, or strike a tread across the Blue Ridge in the trial of 1,000 years. No. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we will live forever or die by suicide. Fellow citizens of the United States, this country and its institutions belongs to the people who inhabit it. Whether they should grow weary of their existing government, they can exercise their constitutional right of amending it, or the revolutionary right to destroy and overthrow it. My countrymen, one and all, take time and think well. Nothing valuable can be lost by taking time. Plainly, the central idea of secession is the very essence of anarchy. Physically speaking, we cannot separate. We cannot remove our respective sections from each other, nor build an impassable wall between them. A husband and wife may divorce and go out of each other's presence and beyond each other's reach. But the different parts of our country cannot do this. They cannot but remain face to face, and intercourse, either amicable or hostile, must continue between them. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, lies the momentous issue of civil war. This government will not assail you unless you first assail it. You can have no conflict without yourselves being the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to defend this government, while I have a most solemn oath to preserve, protect, and defend it. So the question is yours, and not mine. Will it be peace or the sword? We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet sing the chorus of the Union, when once again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. There is one good thing about presidential elections in the United States. By the Constitution, the voters get another chance in 4 years. There is one bad thing about presidential elections in the United States. The president-elect has to sit around for months, powerless to influence events. My speech was received reasonably well, but it wasn't enough to halt the juggernaut of war. I've always hated the idea of war. It turns the public's attention to preening and parading and makes heroes out of generals. I do not appreciate this matter of rank, and I surely do not believe that the military profession should mingle in politics. War glorifies militarism, that attractive rainbow in showers of blood. When I was elected president, there were 33 states that considered themselves united. By the time I was inaugurated president, 27 states were in the Union. And by the time they fired the first shots at Fort Sumter, 23 states were united and 11 confederated. They called themselves the Confederates. I called them disunionists. They reminded me of a gambler playing cards for high stakes. He accused his adversary of foul play and suddenly drew his Bowie knife from his belt and pinned the hand of the opposing player upon the table, saying, "If you haven't got the ace of spades under your palm, I'll apologize." So Washington became an armed camp. Over 250,000 men gathered in the Army of the Potomac, commanded by General George McClellan, who believed himself to be a little Napoleon because the papers told him that he was. Meanwhile, not far away, the Army of Northern Virginia formed, over 100,000 strong, commanded by General Robert E. Lee. I had asked Lee to lead my army against the disunionists. Needless to say, he declined. And so the armies prepared to face each other, blue and gray upon the field of battle. War knows no holidays, but that's how the Civil War began. Citizens actually carried picnic lunches from Washington to the Potomac to watch the first battle unfold along a little creek called Bull Run. Our retreat was led by a shrieking, cowardly congressman with his coattails flying. The military telegraph office is where I got news of the Union battles, mostly bad. "Good morning, boys. Still deciphering dispatches from General McClellan. Well, what's the latest? We have captured 6 horses. What shall we do with them?" Send him this reply, Captain Eckert. "Regarding the 6 captured horses, please milk them." Now, regarding your dispatch about sore-tongued and fatigued horses, may I please ask what the horses in your army have done that should fatigue anything? A. Lincoln. The trouble with McClellan is he has the slows. Sending men to that army is like shoveling fleas across a barnyard. Not half of them get there. Well, I'd hold his horse for him myself if he'd win some battles for me. Of course, McClellan doesn't lose battles. He merely fails to win them. Those are his words, not mine. Make of that what you will. I am afraid that the commanding general of the Union Army doesn't know the difference between a chestnut horse and a horse chestnut. More news from the front. Now General Pope says he has retired to Centerville, where he will be able to hold his men. I do not like that attitude. I don't like hearing that his men need holding. Send him this reply. General Pope, if you are not interested in leading your army in battle, may I borrow it for a time? A. Lincoln. Now what's this? Captured a brigadier general and 110 horses, have they? Oh, for that I am sorry. For the horses. I can make a brigadier general in 5 minutes, but it's not so easy to replace 110 horses. All right, boys, just one or two more, and then I'll leave you alone for a few hours. To Major General Joseph Hooker, I have recently heard of you saying that both the army and the government needed a dictator. It is, of course, not because of this remark, but in spite of it, that I am giving you command. Only those generals who achieve successes can set up as dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship. Hooker's promised to bag the whole crowd, but the hen is the wisest of all animal creation. She never cackles until after the egg is laid. Now, and one more for General Pope. Please stop sending me urgent dispatches entitled Headquarters in the Saddle. Your trouble is your headquarters are where your hindquarters ought to be. Mr. Nicolay, will you take a letter, please? To the Honorable Horace Greeley, New York Tribune. As to the policy you say I seem to be pursuing, I do not mean to leave you or anyone else in any doubt. I would save the Union. I would save it the shortest way possible under the Constitution. My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others, I would also do that. I have stated my purpose as to my understanding of official duty. But I have no intention of modifying my own oft-expressed personal view that all men everywhere should be free. Will you send that ahead of everything else, please? And send a copy to the Washington paper so he can read it there first. Mary, after all these years, you are still a child wife who needs protection from flattering shopkeepers. It seems you have outfitted yourself with an entire issue of Gray's Ladies' Book. Satin bonnets, black laces from England, gloves by the dozen. You are the best friend of the New York merchants. And now this for wallpaper. You have overrun a congressional appropriation by $6,500 for redecorating the White House. I cannot possibly approve of this. I'll pay for it out of my own pocket first. It would stink in the nostrils of the American people if they should hear that the president approved an appropriation for flub-dubs for this damned old house while the soldiers have no blankets. Mary, let us have no more of these extravagances. Mary, I am about to deal with the most urgent business that will ever cross my desk in this White House. The emancipation of the Negroes. Do you remember, Mary, all those years ago when we talked in Springfield? I told you then, if I ever got the chance to hit the institution, I would hit it hard. But the time was not yet ripe. With all my heart, I believe that the purveyors of slavery are blowing out the moral lights around us. Now it is time, because of military and moral necessity. Be seated, gentlemen. First, let us deal with a nettlesome matter that has become one of my most unpopular acts in your state courts. I am referring to the suspension of habeas corpus, so that those traitors arrested as subversives to our Union cause cannot be released simply by a court order. Now, if you believe that I should continue to suspend habeas corpus without congressional approval, please say aye. Secretary of State Seward, nay. Treasury Secretary Chase, nay. Secretary of War Stanton, nay. Attorney General Bates, nay. What say you, Postmaster General Blair? Nay. And you, Navy Secretary Wells? Nay. Finally, Interior Secretary Smith? Nay. Nay, 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 nay. Well, gentlemen, the ayes have it. I am sorry, gentlemen. More rogues than honest men take shelter under habeas corpus, and those subversives are mad dogs who would stop at nothing if released. You know, that reminds me of a story about the man who was walking along a country lane with a pitchfork on his shoulder. As he was walking past the farmhouse, a mad dog rushed out and attacked him, so the man killed the dog with the pitchfork. The angry farmer asked, "Why did you kill my dog?" "Well, why did your dog attack me?" "Why didn't you fend him off with the blunt end?" "Well, why didn't your dog attack me with his blunt end?" What's that, Secretary Wells? How can I indulge in such levity at these times? Sir, if I did not take some momentary respite from the crushing burden I am carrying, I think my heart would break. I laugh because I must not cry. That is all. That is all. And now, gentlemen, we come to a much greater matter. The need of a proclamation for the freedom of the Negroes. Now, I have an argument that even the most wary among you should find difficult to oppose. By putting the black man in Union blue, we will so increase our fighting power that the death knell will be sounded for the Confederacy and for slavery itself. It will bring about a more expeditious end to the war and save innumerable lives. We must remember, gentlemen, that the struggle of today is not altogether for today. It is for a vast future also. I have distributed copies of the Emancipation Proclamation for you to review, while I sign it now. I have never been more certain in my life that I am doing right than I am by signing this paper. But I have been receiving calls and shaking hands since 9 this morning, so that my arm is stiff and numb. Now, this signature is going to be closely examined, and if they believe that my hand trembled, they will say he had compunctions. But nevertheless, it is going to be done. Gentlemen, we are like whalers who have been on a very long chase. We've finally gotten a harpoon in the monster, but unless we steer very carefully, with just a swipe of its tail, it could send us all into oblivion. A proclamation that on the first day of January, A.D., in the year of our Lord, 1863, that all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward, and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons, or any of them, in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence, unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that in all cases when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States, to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. A wave of fury swept the South. The Richmond Enquirer said Abraham Lincoln is outraging private property rights. He is inciting the Negroes to rape, burn, and kill. He is violating all the laws of civilized warfare. Civilized warfare, there's a contradiction. Between May 2nd and May 4th at Chancellorsville, the Union lost 17,000 men. The Confederates over 12,000. In just 3 days, 30,000 boys, blue and gray, all Americans, cut down by bullets and bayonets. Oh, my offense is rank, it smells to heaven. It hath the primal eldest curse upon it, a brother's murder. Pray, can I not, though inclination be as sharp as will? My stronger guilt defeats my strong intent, and like a man to double business bound, I stand and pause where I shall first begin and both neglect. What if this cursed hand were thicker than itself with brother's blood? Is there not rain enough from the sweet heavens to wash it white as snow? But why should God forgive me over the Confederate leaders? Both sides pray to the same God, and each invokes God's aid against the other. No family is immune from tragedy along the battle routes of the South, including my own. Mary has lost 3 brothers fighting in this war. And now that little Willie is dead in the White House. The haunted look in Mary's eyes appalls me. If anything should happen to Robert or Tad or myself, I think it would drive her mad. After further Union disasters, my own Republican senators met in secret caucus to vote on a resolution asking me to resign. But I knew that the country's fortunes were bound up in my own, and if I should resign my position, it would mean certain and inevitable ruin for our country. So I continued with my everyday routine at the White House. Every day at noon, I ordered the doors to be open and for the people who were waiting outside to be admitted. They came to seek me out for clemency for their husbands and sons in uniform, some seeking jobs, others just to pour their hearts out. It gave me a chance to meet with the people, my people. One gentleman came in pleading for me to give him a military pass to go through our lines to the Confederate capital of Richmond. I told him, "My dear sir, I would be most happy to oblige you if my passes were respected, but the fact of it is, in the last 2 years, I have issued over 250,000 military passes to every man in the Army of the Potomac to go to Richmond, and no one's got there yet." Many a friend from the 8th Judicial Circuit came to visit me in Washington. One of them asked, "How does it feel to be president?" And you know what I said? "That reminds me of a story about the man who was tarred and feathered and ridden out of town on a rail." They asked him how he liked it, and he said, "Well, if it weren't for the honor of the thing, I'd much rather have walked." A young nurse came to see me. She had become smitten with one of the soldiers under her care, but the soldier would not tell her where he had been injured. So she figured if she couldn't get it out of him, perhaps the president could. So when I visited the military hospital, I sought him out, and he disclosed the nature of his injury and why he might be reticent to disclose that information to an attractive young lady. So when she came to see me again, she asked me if I had gotten the information out of him, and I told her, "Madam, the shot that hit him would have missed you." The war of attrition had become total war. Houses were burned, railroads ripped up, factories destroyed, cotton put to the torch, cows and provisions foraged. Oh yes, our soldiers had become quite skilled in the art of destruction. I had the men, but I didn't have the general to lead them. No general yet found it face the arithmetic, but I knew the end of the war would be at hand, whence he was discovered. And at last I found my general in Grant, unconditional surrender Grant. He realized that the objective was not Southern real estate, but Southern soldiers. Destroy Lee's army. He had his critics after the Battle of Shiloh for the horrendous casualties, but I told every critic, I cannot spare this man. He fights. General Grant, I have received your latest dispatch about your unwillingness to give up the hold where you are. Neither am I willing. Hold on with a bulldog grip and chew and choke as much as possible. People said that he drank too much, but if drink could make him fight in the way he did, I thought it was time to send a few barrels of his preferred whiskey to my other generals. Maybe we could get the same results. Here's another batch of requests for pardons for men awaiting to be shot for desertion. My generals say I impair military discipline, but it relieves me if I can find an excuse to save a man's life. Mr. Nicolay, will you inscribe a message and send it off without delay? First to Secretary of War Stanton, regarding the 14-year-old soldier sentenced to be shot for desertion. Instead, my dear sir, let us spank this drummer boy and send him home. Yes, Mr. Nicolay, just as I dictated it. Here's another one for Mr. Stanton. Please suspend execution in this latest batch of leg cases. The Army term is cowardice in the face of the enemy. I affectionately refer to them as my leg cases. And I put it to you, if God gave a man a pair of cowardly legs, how can he help but not run off with them? This one is for Major General Sheridan in the field. Please suspend execution in this case and set record of the trial to me for further review. If a man had more than one life, I don't think hanging would hurt this one much. But as he does only have one life, I think I will pardon him. A. Lincoln. The grim news from Gettysburg started coming into Washington. Gettysburg should have been the last battle. We had Lee's army bottled up, but he got away. We buried 6,832 men at Gettysburg. I was asked to attend the dedication of the military cemetery to make a few appropriate remarks. Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work before us. It is for the living rather to be dedicated thus to that cause, for thus what they here so far have so nobly achieved. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these honored dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That speech won't scour. The bloodshed continued for a year and a half after the dedication at Gettysburg. But the outcome was inevitable. The Union had the men, the industry, and a cause of freedom on its side, while the rebels had nothing more than a dying dream of a separate government for Dixieland. We cannot have free government without elections. So in 1864, the United States became the first nation in history to hold national elections in the midst of its own civil war. Improbably, I was elected to a second term as president. At my first inauguration in 1861, the thing had not yet begun, but the storm clouds were gathering. By the time of my second inauguration, in March 1865, the thing had not yet ended, but the end was in sight. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that the mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and that every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As it was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. About a month later, General Grant broke a 9-month siege at Petersburg, south of the Confederate capital in Richmond. The next day, Lee and what little was left of the Army of Northern Virginia abandoned their capital and fled into Virginia. General Sheridan sent a dispatch to General Grant, "If the thing is pressed, I think Lee will surrender." He got his response directly from me, "Let the thing be pressed." And then, on Palm Sunday, Grant messaged Stanton, April 9th. General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia this afternoon on terms proposed by myself. Grant allowed the surrendered men in gray to take their mules and their horses and go back home to begin spring plowing. It was time for seeds, not men, to be buried in the American soil. A new dawn rose over Washington to the boom of cannon. Through the gaslit, muddy streets, the crowd surged towards the White House. Citizens linked arms with mud-splattered soldiers who had marched from the Mississippi through the shell holes of Shiloh. Brass bands blared, and above the strident jubilation, I heard the cries for Father Abraham. On the balcony of the White House, Tad flew a captured Confederate flag, and cheers rose as he waved the stars and bars. And beneath me, I could see Negro soldiers standing guard, rifles at the ready, dressed in Union blue. The language of the emancipation had become a reality. And as the laughing, crying mass of humanity quieted down, I said, I propose we conclude this interview by asking the band to play a particular tune. I have always thought Dixie one of the best tunes I ever heard. But Father Abraham could only think of the thousands of grieving families all over the land, and the tens of thousands of dead soldier boys who did not survive to see this celebration after long winters of war. To Mrs. Bixby, Boston, Massachusetts, dear Madam, I have been shown in the files of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you are the mother of 5 sons who have died gloriously on the field of battle. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any word of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from tendering you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage you the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memory of the loved and lost. And that this solemn feeling that must be yours, to have loved and laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. Yours very sincerely and respectfully, A. Lincoln. After 4 years of civil strife, the death toll amounted on both sides to more than 500,000 men. The hatred festered by those violent years would not quickly heal. The sacrifices would not be easily forgotten. But at least the slaughter had ceased, and the bitterness would eventually fade away into memory. I wanted to see Richmond. I wanted to see for the first time slaves without shackles, walking in the streets as free men. Over 1,300,000 men, women, and children had been freed by the emancipation. Oh, please, please, you must not kneel to me. You must kneel only before God and thank Him for the liberty which you will enjoy forevermore. I am but God's humble instrument. But as long as I live, I promise no one will ever put a shackle on your legs, and you shall be as free as any other citizen of this great nation. My friends, you are free. Free as the air. You may cast off the name of slave and trample on it. Liberty is now our common birthright. God has given it to you as He gave it to others. Try to deserve this priceless boon. Learn the laws and obey them, and obey God's commandments. Now then, let me pass. I must return to Washington to secure the liberty which you rightfully value so highly. The people of the North owe Mr. Lincoln eternal hatred and scorn. There are now over 500,000 freshly dug graves, over 500,000 orphans, nearly 200,000 widows, thieves in the treasury, provost marshals in the seats of justice. And all this we owe Mr. Lincoln. As the Lord liveth, we will in time pay him back for all we owe him. Him and his bloody band of traitors. Oh, Mary. I can't say that I believe in dreams, but I had one the other night that has haunted me ever since. Perhaps I should not be relating this to you, but it's taken possession of me, and like Banquo's ghost, it just won't down. It happened about 10 days ago. I was working very late into the night, waiting for dispatches from the front, and I fell asleep. In my dream, there was a death-like stillness about me. I could hear sounds of subdued sobbing, as if a number of people were mourning. And in my dream, I went downstairs. The silence was broken by sounds of pitiful sobbing, and I was determined to find the cause. As I entered the east room, I was greeted by a sickening sight. In front of me, there was a corpse dressed in funeral vestments, mourners wailing, soldiers standing on guard. "Who is dead in the White House?" I asked. "The president. He was killed by an assassin." And then there's this other thing, Mary. Do you know the guard who I spend my evenings with, Mr. William Crook? We have this silly little ritual where every night he says, "Good night, Mr. Lincoln," and I say, "Good night, Mr. Crook." Last night I said, "Goodbye, Mr. Crook." Goodbye. As if I'd never see him again. Well, Mary, maybe it is just my morbid imagination. The reality is, the war is over. The Union preserved, the Negroes freed. And we will yet have time to recite, as we did in our youth, from Robert Burns. "So fair art thou, my bonny lass, and so deep in love am I. And I will love thee still, my dear, till all the seas dang dry. Till all the seas dang dry, my dear, and rocks melt with the sun. And I will love thee still, my dear, while the sands of life do run." And then, Mary, after a few more years in Washington, we're going home, back to Springfield, to spend the rest of our lives in peace. Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. We will be remembered in spite of ourselves. No personal significance or insignificance can save one or any of us. The fiery trials through which we have passed will light us down, in honor or dishonor, to the latest generation. We say we are for union. The world will not forget that we say this. In giving freedom to the slave, We assure freedom for the free, honorable and like in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth. I believe I will leave here a better man for having realized here what a very poor sort of man I am. I hope I have never in my life knowingly planted a thorn in another man's bosom, for I believe that men weave in their own lives the garment that they must wear in the world to come.